everyone. Welcome back to Pilgrim Stories. Today's book is The Pilgrims at Plymouth by Lucille Penney. This is a long book, so instead of reading the whole thing, I'm only going to read some of the pages. First page, The Mayflower. What was it like to sail across the vast and mysterious Atlantic Ocean in a little wooden ship? The Mayflower was only 90 feet long. That's 4 feet shorter than a basketball court. 102 passengers, 30 seamen, and all their belongings were crowded into this little space. The captain of the Mayflower, Master Christopher Jones, had his own cabin. The ship's officers shared one. The sailors simply wrapped themselves in a piece of old sailcloth and slept in any handy spot. Most of the passengers lived and slept below decks. They spread blankets or lumpy mattresses on the floor and piled their belongings next to them. There was hardly any room to move when everyone was packed in. The ceiling was less than 5 feet high. Most adults had to walk stooped over. So I am 5'2". So even I, who am not very tall, would have to stoop to walk down there. And it was hard to see in the crowded quarters. There were no lights. It was too dangerous to use candles. The wooden ship might catch fire. During the day, a little light drifted in through cracks in the ceiling. At night, it was black. The ship smelled of unwashed bodies and unwashed clothes. Hardly anyone changed clothes even once during the long voyage. The men trimmed their beards, and the women braided their hair. They kept themselves neat, but it was impossible to keep clean. In stormy weather, big waves rolled the ship from side to side. People rolled too. A lot of them were seasick. The wind roared along the deck, and icy rain poured through every crack onto the huddled passengers. It was a cold, wet, terrifying trip. But Master Jones and his crew worked hard to keep the ship moving steadily. Slowly, the little Mayflower crossed the huge, empty ocean and sailed toward the American shore. Handfuls of corn. Muskets at the ready, the Pilgrim explorers walked along the sandy white beach. On one side was the gray ocean. On the other side, the dark forest loomed. Suddenly they stopped and stared. A group of strange men and a dog were coming toward them. Indians. The Indians stared too. Then they turned and raced into the forest. They whistled for their dog, which, after stopping to look at the Pilgrims, followed them. The Pilgrims dashed after them, but the Indians were faster. Soon they had disappeared. The Pilgrims lost their way among the dark trees. The thorny bushes tore at their clothes and scratched their armor. They were hungry and thirsty. Finally, they came upon a spring of fresh water. It was delicious. The Pilgrims drank and drank. When they felt better, they walked on. They came to a hill covered with little heaps of sand. The Pilgrims dug into one of the heaps and found a big basket filled with Indian seed corn. They stuffed handfuls into their pockets. They poured more corn into an old iron kettle they found nearby, which must have been left by earlier explorers. But when the Pilgrims dug into some other heaps, they found skeletons. They had stumbled onto an Indian graveyard. Carefully, they covered the graves they had disturbed. On their way back to the Mayflower, the Pilgrims saw a tree that had been bent over and tied to the ground. Under the tree was a little mound of acorns. It was strange. William Bradford stepped closer to get a good look. Suddenly he gave a cry. A noose had closed over his foot. The tree shot up into the air, and he was dangling upside down. He had stepped into an Indian deer trap. The men cut him down and returned to the ship. They had walked for many miles, but still they had not found a place to build their new homes. They would have to go exploring again. A new home. The blue waters of Plymouth Harbor sparkled in bright sunlight. Beyond the beach grew a tall green forest. Ducks, herons, swans, and geese nested along the shore. Flounder and cod swam in the cold ocean current. The sandy bottom was home for all kinds of shellfish. The Pilgrims pulled the shallop ashore and went exploring. They found a brook. In England, people didn't drink much water. They dumped their garbage into rivers and streams. The water tasted terrible. But here, the water was sweet and clear. Strawberries, raspberries, herbs, watercress, leeks, and onions grew nearby. The forest was full of pine, walnut, birch, ash, beech, and sassafras trees. It would be wonderful to have so much wood available, but big trees were hard to cut down. It took a long time to fell even one tree with an axe. That is why the Pilgrims were happy to find that fields for planting had already been cleared by the Indians, although there was no sign that Indians lived anywhere nearby. From the top of a high hill, the men could look over the surrounding countryside and far out to sea. Miles Standish said that this would be a good place to put cannons. It would be easy to defend this spot. Plymouth wasn't perfect. The Pilgrims would have liked to start their colony where a river ran into the sea. They wanted to be able to sail inland to hunt and to trade with the Indians, but time was running out. They returned to the Mayflower. "We have good news," they told their friends. "We have found our new home." Now, one of the interesting things is you can see in this picture the big harbor. And they needed to know if there was enough water for a big ship like the Mayflower. The little ship, the shallop that they had used, that was fine, but they didn't want their big ship to get stuck if it was too shallow. So they had a very interesting way. When you look, all you can see is water, and you can't tell how deep it is everywhere. But what they would do is they would take a very long rope and put a lead weight at the bottom, and then they would tie knots in it. And the distance between each knot was the same. So then, in the little shallop, they would drop this down till the lead got to the bottom, and they would count how many knots they let out, and then they would know how deep the water was. and in Plymouth Harbor there was enough water for the big Mayflower. Hard times. What could the Pilgrims do for shelter against the rain, the wind, and the cold while they built their houses? Already many of them were weak and sick. They begged Master Jones to anchor the Mayflower in Plymouth Harbor until the first houses were finished. But the sailors were anxious to return to England. Some of them wanted to put the Pilgrims and their belongings on shore at once and sail home. But Master Jones was a good friend to the Pilgrims. He agreed to stay. This meant that the women and children could remain on the ship with their belongings, and the men had a dry place to return to each night to sleep. But even with the Mayflower for shelter, the Pilgrims suffered a terrible winter. They couldn't plant their crops until the frozen ground thawed. They didn't know how to live off the land. Most wild fruits had already shriveled in the cold. Sometimes they found nuts and acorns, but never enough to fill their stomachs. The ocean and brooks teemed with fish, but they hadn't brought the right sort of hooks to catch them. There were animals in the woods, but the Pilgrims didn't know how to make deer traps like the one that had caught William Bradford. Their muskets were clumsy to aim and tremendously loud. After a shot was fired, all the animals ran away. So the Pilgrims tightened their belts, worked hard, shivered with cold, and looked forward to the warmth and plenty of spring. Raising the rafters. The weather got worse and worse. It rained and blew so hard that the Pilgrims couldn't even sail the shallop to shore. In fact, Master Jones had to have 2 extra anchors thrown overboard to keep the Mayflower itself from blowing away. A work party finally landed on December 23rd and began the construction of the common house, a building that would be shared by all. The weather stayed so bad it took 23 days to build. Next, they laid out a street. Its name was simply the street. There wasn't any other street to confuse it with. The street led from the beach to a steep hill. At the top, the Pilgrims built a wooden platform for their heavy cannons. Then lots were laid out along the street. They were very narrow. The Pilgrims didn't have the energy or the materials to build big houses. 1-room houses would have to do. Single men and servants had to live with families. That way, there would be fewer houses to build. One by one, the little houses began to rise. Each one had a big fireplace for cooking. A chimney carried most of the smoke outside, and also most of the heat. These little houses weren't very warm. The houses were dark, too. They had small windows, and in place of glass, the Pilgrims used cloth rubbed with oil. Floors were packed down dirt, scattered with a carpet of rushes. A ladder led to a loft where food was stored in sacks and barrels. More food, if the harvest was successful, would be kept in 2 storehouses that the Pilgrims built near their common house. They planned to store their food together and share all they had. The Pilgrims were beginning to carve a real town from the wilderness. So, here is how they would make boards for their houses. They would dig a pit about 6 feet deep, and then they would lay a huge log across the pit. Then one man jumped in, and another stood above him, and together they sawed the log into boards. So here's the log. It's got its sides, the round sides are cut off, and now they're starting to saw it. They have a big, long saw. Can you see? There's a handle for the guy up here, and there's another handle on the other end for the guy at the bottom. So that up and down is how they would saw their logs. And so then they would nail them onto the house, and they would use reeds or the stems of plants to make the roof. And they'd make it really thick, but still it wasn't perfect for keeping out rain. Squanto. Who was Squanto? Where had he come from? How had he learned English? Squanto was a Patuxet Indian. He had been born right where the Pilgrims built their town. But before the Pilgrims sailed on the Mayflower, Squanto had been kidnapped by an English sea captain. After several years in England and Spain, he managed to return home. But when he got to Plymouth, he found that all the Patuxets, every member of his family, and all his friends had died of plague. Nothing was left of his home but deserted fields strewn with bones. So Squanto went to live with Massasoit and his tribe, the Wampanoags. But after he met the Pilgrims, Squanto decided to stay with them. He lived with them at Plymouth for the rest of his life and helped them in many important ways. Do you know what that is? That's not a snake. That's an eel. And they used to eat eels. I've never had an eel, have you? Squanto taught them to plant corn in the spring when the oak leaves are as big as a mouse's ear. 4 or 5 corn seeds had to be planted together in a little hill of earth. 1 or 2 herrings, which is a kind of fish, were put in each hill along with the seeds. The herrings provided food for the plants as they grew. Without this corn, the Pilgrims would have starved. The seeds they had brought from England produced hardly any grain or vegetables at all. Squanto also taught the Pilgrims which plants and berries were safe to eat. He showed them how to tread eels out of the mud with their feet and how to spear large fish. And he was their guide when they needed to travel through the strange dark forest to hunt or to trade with Indians. Governor William Bradford wrote in his journal that Squanto was a special instrument sent of God for the Pilgrims' good beyond their expectations. So, some of the other things that the Indians taught the Pilgrims, they taught them about fishing. They caught fish with spears, which is this long guy here. Got the point at the end. Nets woven with grasses and hooks made from animal bones.